Hello everyone, my name is Oops I Dev'd, and today we're gonna have a look at input actions in Godot 4. Let's get into it. If you've ever pressed a button in a game to run, jump, attack, or just pause the game, congratulations, you already know what an input action is. Input actions allow us to use a keyboard, a mouse, or a controller to interact with the game. In Godot 4, you define new input actions underneath the Input Map tab in your project settings. In Godot 4, there are also already built-in input actions that you can add to or edit or even delete if you want. The UI underscore in these naming conventions refers to user input. Let's just keep this naming convention for our input actions, or else the balance of the universe will collapse. Just kidding. I'm just very finicky on keeping things patterned or the same. You can either add or access or use Godot inputs in its built-in input function or via the input object. You will use the input object if you want the state of the input action stored all throughout the game loop, because it is independent from any node or scene. You will use the input function if you only want the input to be detected but not tracked during the game loop. There are several functions you can use for checking the state of your input. In other words, is it pressed or released? That is what we mean when we refer to the input state. Let's look at a diagram to elaborate on this. We have the isActionPressed function. This function checks if the action is currently in the press state, meaning the user is still pressing the button, and if so, it will return true. Then we have the isActionReleased function, and this checks if the action is not being pressed anymore, meaning the user has released the button, and returns true if so. Then we have the functions isActionJustPressed or isActionJustReleased, and these you can only access if you use the input class. So the isActionPressed function will check if the input or the button has been pressed only once, and then return true, and then it'll stop the input. Then the isActionJustReleased function checks has it been released, and then returns true. We can also use the mouse to detect mouse input using the built-in subclass InputEventMouse, which handles the input for both mouse buttons as well as the mouse motion. Unlike regular buttons though, mouse wheel clicks only produce pressed events instead of both pressed and released state events. Okay, enough beating around the bush. Let's see this in action. We'll start with the input actions for our normal keys, like our keyboard or our controller, and not our mouse yet. Okay, so open up your Godot project, and let's create a new scene with the node 2D as the root. Let's rename it as main, and save it. Let's add a script to it, and then we can add our own inputs. Let's add some in the project settings input map tab. Remember, you can always show the built-in actions by enabling this toggle. You can then see which keys have already been defined for actions, and you can delete or add or edit them as you'd like. Let's add a new action called UIPrint. To this action, I'm only going to map one key to it, and that will be the tab key on my keyboard. You can add any type of controller button you'd like or any key that you'd like. I'm just going to go with tab. Okay, now we see that we have an input and a key assigned to that input. Now we can use it in our script. Let's use this input event function to see if a key has been pressed or released, and then we'll print the state of that. So to do that, we'll say if event.isActionPressed, and then our action that we just defined, which will be UIPrint. Then we'll print tab was pressed. Then we'll need to see if it's been released. So we can do the same, but just with isActionReleased. Okay, so let's call our input class in our unhandled input event function. You can call the input class and all its functions from anywhere you'd like. It's not just for the unhandled input function. So to do this, we'll do basically the same as above. We'll just say if input, because we're calling the class, dot isActionJustPressed. So basically, we're just going to check if the tab button was clicked and released. Okay. Then we're going to do the same for the isActionJustReleased. Okay. So here we have our two input events. So the first one will check if it's been pressed and released. Then the unhandled input function will check if it's just been pressed and just released. And then there's another one that will constantly see if a button is being pressed. We'll do this in our process function. So for this, we'll also use our input class because it's callable in every other function. And we constantly want to check if a button is currently being pressed. So we'll say, like, instead of is action just pressed or just released, we'll say is action pressed. Then we'll print tab is being pressed because the process function fires off every second. So it's constantly going to use that input class to see if this button is being pressed. Whereas in the input events function, it only checks once. Let's run our scene. Now if we press tab, let's see what happens. You'll see in the output console that the first thing that fired off was the input events function. We can see that via tab was pressed and tab was released. So as soon as we pressed tab, it sensed that it was being pressed. Then the unhandled events function fired off and saw that the action was yet again being pressed, but it only checked once because it's only checking once for is action just pressed. But in the process function, because it's firing off every delta time, which is every second, it was constantly checking the state of the button. So for as long as I was holding in tab, it was saying it's being pressed. Then at the end, we can see that once we release the key, both is action released and is action just released said, hey, tab was released or tab was just released. I just want to reiterate that the only difference between the input events function and the input class is that it's callable everywhere, all throughout the game loop, whereas the input events function is tied down to one node. So this input event function will only work if this scene is being run or instanced where it can run. If you don't instance the scene or it's not your main scene, this input events function will not fire. Hope that makes sense to you. In a real game, you'd use these input events to move your character around, interact with objects, launch UI menus, etc. Now, let's see how we can add some mouse inputs using the input event mouse subclass. In your script, let's see if the mouse wheel is being rolled up or down. We'll do this by checking the input event mouse button subclass in our unhandled events expression. So to do this, we'll say if event is input event mouse button. So this will see if the input action currently being done is a mouse button press. Then we need to check the button index. So if it's mouse wheel up or mouse wheel down. So if it is mouse wheel button down, we'll print wheel input down captured. Then we need to do the same for up. So now every time we scroll our mouse wheel up or down, this should print. Let's run our scene to see if this works. Now if I scroll up, oh look, wheel input up captured. If I scroll down, wheel input down captured. That is how you do a input event mouse button event. Now, let's see a motion input. We're going to add a sprite that will rotate in relation with our mouse position. For this sprite 2D, I'm just going to use the icon.svg texture that comes with the project as its texture. So it'll look like this. I'm just going to scale it down a bit and move it to the center of our screen, which will be in this blue border. Now we first need to define a variable that will capture our mouse's speed. So that is the speed that it will rotate. You do have to make this variable a very small amount because the mouse moves so quickly. Then, in our unhandled input event, let's see if our event is a mouse motion event. If it is a mouse motion event, meaning we're moving the mouse around, we will rotate our sprite 2D in its x-axis relative to the mouse speed. Let's launch our scene to see the action. See now if we move our mouse, the sprite will also rotate. But I doubt you'll do something like this. This was just an example of some of the events that you can add with the input event mouse subclass. And that's it for input actions for now. In future tutorials, when we make actual games, we will be able to see how these work a little bit more in depth and in a bit more of a practical scenario. But I do hope that this video helped you get a basic understanding of input actions and how to add them into your game in Godot 4. Once again, like I always do, I recommend that you go and play around and experiment with the different input actions, not only for your input events function, but also your input class and your input event mouse subclass. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you'd like. Until next time, bye!